Hi everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm out for a walk in the garden. I'm looking at some beautiful hummingbird sage plants returning to their seasonal greenery and just starting to produce a few buds. And the hummingbird sage plants have an incredible fragrant oily substance that they produce on their flowers and some on their leaves. And it's just an amazing scent, but it's a little bit oily and sticky. So some people won't, want to have that on their fingers, but I just love it. It seems like a natural balm. And I absolutely love the sages, all of them, particularly the whirly blue is one of my favorites. Its flowers produce an amazing nectar. Just a moment, I'm having a little interaction with one of my friends here, my blue jay friend. It's wonderful to have a wild bird land on my hand and just feel the life, the spirit of that little animal. A spirit as big as a mountain inside a very small creature. So I have a little bit of a game plan today. I'm going to orbit the topics of language, identity, and meaning. And this will necessarily draw me into some explorations of knowledge. Now, problematically, although our words have different senses, and by senses, I mean the numbered definitions that we might find associated with a given word in the dictionary. And these are the formal senses of words. So that, for example, if I use the word vision, two senses that come immediately to mind are very, relatively simple. One is to see, right? To have vision is to be able to see, or to be seeing. But of course, there's another sense of vision which is much more mysterious and has to do with the idea of something we find deeply transformative or oracular or wise. To see, to have far seeing, but not just in terms of what we see with our eyes, but rather how we use our minds to imagine analogies and meanings and connections and qualities, possible futures, repercussions of actions, and so on. And so we have this word visionary that implies a kind of far-seeing or really deep-seeing that's uncommon to many of us in our ordinary experience, even though nearly all of us have visions at night. We have dreams. And dreaming is a kind of visionary event. But there are other kinds, and there are kinds that resemble dreaming very closely, and other kinds that resemble something more like lucid dreaming, and other kinds that resemble, well, I don't know if they resemble anything. There are other forms that are deeply non-ordinary. I've had the experience of being almost literally knocked to the floor, immediately in a state of paradreaming, where a vision is then sort of put into me is how it feels. By what, I don't know. However, I suspect by another aspect of my being, or my soul, or my awareness, that is not like the waking aspect and is often inhibited by the presence of the waking aspect. So in order for me to have the vision, essentially, I had to allow myself to be almost knocked unconscious. I've had other experiences where a visionary aspect of my experience drew me very compelled me toward unconsciousness, and I resisted because I was afraid. I was afraid of dying. And I never gave in to those somewhat more severe experiences, unfortunately. I now wish I had. But I have had the sudden feeling of, oh, I can't stand up anymore, I must lie down. The moment I lie down, visions arise. And these visions usually had to do with events that were about to occur in my life, sometimes fairly ordinary events, like I was about to receive a visitor or something, and the vision would be about them. And often when I spoke of this to the visitor, who was unknown to me actually, they verified some of the things I'd seen in my vision. One of them was a doctor, and I described the layout of his house to him and his dog, and he was very surprised that I could know about those things, since we had never met and had no contact before he showed up at my home for a house call. That didn't actually go terribly well, but the visions were, I think, related to the idea of precognition, right? To know before situations and events arise. So the vision of seeing and the idea of sight is the analogy we use to describe our interiority. Even though inside us what's going on clearly isn't seeing. And during dreaming, of course, our eyes are closed. And yet, there is a world inside us where perhaps a metalog of seeing, right? Not a mere analog, but something more primordial than ordinary vision is going on. And of course, for people who have always been blind, we lack the language to understand what happens when they dream, except what they may, share with us. Because for us who are sighted, dreaming weaves that sense into the interior experience. Now, all of these matters are extremely mysterious. Very basic things like identity, language, and knowledge are profoundly mysterious. As far as we know, there's no other creature on earth that uses and is used by, and that's the important additive there, formal representational cognition, which is the kind of thinking and mind associated with language, ideas, and concepts, models, and theories, and proofs, evaluations, and so on. When I say things are deeply mysterious, we have a really bad problem, a really thorny problem as human beings. And the simplest way to say it is something like, we are inclined to stop learning once we know the name of something. In other words, we confuse being able to point at some phenomenon with a word, the way I might do if I say this is a tree, with understanding of what we're referring to. So if we have the word, we're inclined, many of us in some situations, to dismiss the phenomenon we have the word for and go on to the next thing, whatever that might be. And this is deeply troubling for all kinds of reasons. It results in various sort of catastrophic processes in human cognition, and particularly in our what we call our culture, which I would argue in America isn't much of a culture at all. It's rather an anti-culture masquerading as a culture. And so what we have are tokens and representations and transactions instead of roles, learning together, and relationships. But my simple point was, knowing the names of things tells us nothing about their nature or our nature or the potentials and opportunities and dangers of relation. Formal knowledge about things can tell us some things about opportunities and dangers. We know, for example, that fire, uncontrolled, can be dangerous, could hurt us or other beings. And we also know that fire, under the right circumstances, can keep us warm or cook our food. And of course, not merely fire, but in the modern milieu, something similar to fire, which is radiation. The stuff that comes out of light bulbs and microwaves and our computing devices and our phones. But those things are deeply mysterious, and we're very, very naive as a species and in general about the effects of the technologies we invent, which continue the process of reducing knowledge, relationships, opportunities and threats to tokens, transactions, theories, and models. Now, some degree of that's natural for animals like us in our current circumstances, but it's important to understand that it wasn't always. And if we take as the norm, if we look at the history of the development of our minds, as we very crudely can reconstruct it from documents and artifacts, we'll discover, surprisingly, that for most of human history, probably 90% of it, knowledge came from intimacy and was rarely tokenized. In fact, in many indigenous societies, the transfer of knowledge is a sacred ceremony involving gifts that were given to our people, transmitted to our people, from living places and animals and plants and relationships, in circumstances that moderns would believe to sound either superstitious or perhaps religious or ridiculous. But that appearance is misleading, and it's the result of the way our cognition developed, I think particularly once we began building settlements, right? Once our people stopped being nomadic and moving and living in and with the living places throughout the seasonal transformations of the environment. So we have this problem of having very sophisticated systems of tokens. I'm using them now. And although I understand the basic meaning of the words that I'm using,
I don't remember the
if I trace their structure, it's a very peculiar thing that I end up discovering, a very profound thing, and a very powerful thing to see and understand, which is that the tree of concepts that our languages comprise, and a tree is just one way of thinking about it. One moment. I'm visiting one of my plant friends and saying hello for a moment. And my bird friends are nearby and very vigilant for an opportunity to share food. Let's see how this might go. Our modern cognition is, or can be understood as a vast stratification of layers of development that happened over the history of the evolution of the minds that we moderns inherit and are impressed upon us by our cultures and languages and peers. And it's very clear to me that the hypothesis that our language, the languages we learn, particularly if we learn but a single language like myself, I know only one formal human language, English, though I'm linguistically curious and have dabbled in Hebrew and Arabic and French and occasionally German and other languages to learn a little more about how the world of ideas transforms into language in systems outside of English. But what I wanted to talk about for a moment, and it's something I'm profoundly interested in, and have spoken of at length in other videos, is the idea that our languages are tree-like, and our capacity to understand them meaningfully depends on roots that we ordinarily don't pay much attention to. So in order to understand what a tree is, we have to first know something about everything. Like, what is it to be alive? What is it to be human? What is the universe up to? What's it for? What's it doing? Is it purposive? What is the world? What is the sun? What are people? What are words? Right? So anytime we use any language at all of these aspects, these root elements, they are alive underneath the superficial structure of the language that we're using. And if they were subtracted, we would not be able to make meaning. Now, of course, our grasp on any of these root concepts is very minimal. No one knows what the universe is or is doing. Well, it's not entirely true, but very difficult to know much about that in ordinary language, because in order to understand something that mysterious, what we need is not so much knowledge or someone telling us things. We need experience, the same kind of experience that you have when you taste food or kiss someone you love. or cuddle with a beloved pet, or jump into a body of living water. And this is an entirely different kind of knowledge, right? In fact, we don't usually associate immediately the word knowledge with intimacy unless we've been given cues that that's the direction to take our interpretation. But for the ancient peoples, knowledge came from intimacy, from living with and for and as other beings, living places, lineages of family, and also companions and competitors or even enemies. And the fascinating thing about discovering that there are roots to meaning, that there are precursors, that we have to at least make a place for, even though we're not aware of it, before we can begin to understand the strange games of language that the adult humans play. And when we are born, we bring with us forms of knowledge that there's no record of in human culture. There's plenty of theory, and there's academic perspectives, clinical perspectives, theoretical perspectives. But the intelligence that we bring to our human birth, and that eventually gets subsumed by human culture and language and concepts and models, and thus disappears for most of us, though it may survive on little islands of passion or creativity or deeply felt sentiment. But the intelligence that we're born with is so profound that it can acquire the language and the culture not merely of any human culture we might be born into, but perhaps of any kind of culture, including the culture of plants, animals, living places, but also including non-ordinary cultures. Cultures of beings whose nature is not obvious in regular language and becomes confused by our ideas about religion, spirituality, philosophy, science, ways of knowing, right? These are each ways of knowing. And all of these ways of knowing are linked, and the thing the child brings to their birth, and of course each child is unique and has unique gifts and also vulnerabilities, or how to put this? Let's see. Aspects that are not yet well developed, or that may even be inhibited from development. The intelligence we bring to human birth is capable, and I think longs, to know the other intelligences that are accessible to us. And those intelligences are infinite in form and kind. They're limitless. And while I'm not trying to tell anyone what to think or how to see, it's my experience that the tiny island of human representational consciousness, for all of its seeming advancement and sophistication, not always a good property, that sophistication, is blind and blinding to the other forms of knowledge and the other kinds of intelligence that are natural to our human nature, our human form. But the intelligence that is brought to the world in our infants and is alive in them, it longs for non-ordinary companions. And we have many stories about this, and in fact we make endless films about it. One of the bizarre things about that is that human beings, endowed as we are with our astonishing capacities for intelligence, creativity, learning, skillfulness, crafting, manipulation with our hands, singing, dancing, these incredible gifts they languish. Yeah. Once we begin to acquire the veneer of representational thought from adults and our peers and our culture and television and computers and so on, the roots of the intelligence become compromised by the structured forms that we inherit and are emphasized, rewarded, and demanded by our modern cultural milieus. Although, again, I'm prone to think of them as anti-cultural mostly. And this is another problem in that in representational cognition, we can counterfeit vision. We can counterfeit knowledge. We can counterfeit understanding or awareness. We can even counterfeit aspects of consciousness. And these can be sold back to us because in our interiority, we're starving to death inside for deeply meaningful experiences of role, who we are, who we can be in a situation or relationship, knowledge, deep understanding. Much of that is visionary, not conceptual. And effectively meaningful relationships in nature, with our own minds, with our own hearts. Right? So as we are deprived of these things, and as they become more inhibited throughout the process of our enculturation and languaging that we undergo in youth, but also throughout our entire life, it continues. We are losing, we're losing something priceless. We're trading the living vessel for something like the token of its steering wheel, right? The representation of its steering wheel. And I'm thinking of a ship's wheel here. And that pain of that loss and that inhibition and that deprivation of being exposed to knowledge that is deep and rich and alive and older than anything language can encompass and more true than anything facts could ever deliver. Because the nature of its truth, the domain in which that truth exists, is itself alive. And when we are joined with that domain, we return to life the same way a plant that's been denied sunlight returns to life when suddenly the sun emerges. Life returns when we can reconnect with these things. And of course, there are many plots, and such in our culture that counterfeit what's missing and sell us the broken skeleton, the dead thing, that we're starving to relate with in a living, authentic way. And so we find Enlightenment traditions, cults, religions, cults of opinion, cults of theory, cults of language. And for most of us, we will be very lucky if we can develop any of the skills we need to interact in a way, to interact with human culture and knowledge in a way that doesn't just continually keep depriving us, starving us inside, for a return to our natural intelligence and curiosity and playfulness and awe, wonder, reverence, words I adore. And this results in pain. and it results in addiction, and it results in crime, poverty, suicide, loss. It results in rape. And in fact, what happens to the child in most families, there are exceptions, is that the child's, the sort of glowing star of intelligence and hunger for deep relation that comes to earth in the form of the human child, it's the energies that fund it, right, that fund that intrinsic brightness, are shunted away from it into representational thought, language, conceptual thought, rules, laws, politics, technology, relations with devices, and so on. Now, in case you, of course, there are many exceptions, and each of us embodies unique exceptions, right? Things we've managed to preserve through the catastrophic crisis of our childhood experience of enculturation and enlanguaging and imprinting. And not all of that is bad, and in fact it doesn't have to be bad at all. It's a problem of precedence, right? The formal representational assets quickly acquire precedence, and they overwhelm, inhibit, and actively threaten many of the faculties and intelligences, and there are myriads of these, that are natural to our human form. And this proceeds over time, so we end up falling off a cliff that gets steeper every time we drop a level. And we fall faster, and there's more damage taken. But the originary intelligences and faculties that are our human inheritance are always present in us, even if they are severely buried or inhibited. And many of our reactive proclivities are actually symptomatic expressions of the pain of this loss and inhibition. Our modern cultures have the capacity to embrace our human interiority, to nourish and protect the incredible gifts that are our inheritance, but they don't. And even where they do, it tends to be in highly structured forms. Now, some of us are able to achieve something like escape velocity from the gravity of our representational and technological cultures, so that we can exist within them and continue to develop our interiority and our relationship with the invisibles, within and around and without us. But for the vast majority of people, we will be trapped in various ways, either by poverty, and there's lots of different kinds. It was very uncommon for me to encounter a truly intelligent adult as a child. And those were magical moments when that happened. That should not be so. And the peculiar forms of intelligence that the teachers tend to convey to the children are too oriented toward producing a form that fits in modern society, rather than a form that fits with the unique gifts, inhibitions, and potentials of each human being. I was reading a book by Philip Regal that I like a lot called The Anatomy of Judgment. I strongly recommend it. And in the book he was talking with a colleague about the possibility of teaching people how to become who they are inside, how to fulfill their unique nature as a human being, as an animal, as an organism, as a being. And his colleague, who was in child development, basically said, you know, this is a non-topic in academia. Whenever I've brought it up, people quickly dismissed it as too fuzzy, There's no funding. You can't publish. And the author said, well, don't you think that adults would be interested in having their children learn how to become and fulfill the uniqueness that they bring to their, incarnation? And his colleague said, no, quite the opposite. What the adults are mostly worried about is causing their children to fit in to the modern milieu and get jobs and work and be able to buy homes and, be successful in material and monetary terms. And very few, but not none, of the parents care much about the development of the unique children they give birth to. Now, when I speak of these things, I'm talking about generalities and norms, and it's important to realize there are all kinds of exceptions. There are parents, and what I'll call alloparents, who are brilliant at nurturing the uniqueness and individuality of their children, while still, often anyway, managing to properly equip them for relating with culture and society and money and pragmatics. And by alloparents, I mean adopted parents, right? Children, young people, teenagers, young adults, middle-aged people, even old people. We often form bonds that are familial, with others who are not from our family. I have a number of relationships that are very dear to my heart, in which, although we are friends, I also play the role of alloparent or companion, older companion, right, elder. And humans are really good at forming allofamilies. And this is one way to think of what a tribe is. A tribe is an allofamily, right? A superfamily of families. Yeah? But an allofamily can be any collection of people, and we can form them even spontaneously. Right? We can form them just for a short time and then they dissolve again. Or we can form them in such a way that they deepen and continue over time. Now, when I began my talk, I was thinking about knowledge, language, and identity. How do we know what something is? Well, most of us know by referring to a linguistic tree, and we find a category, right? And then we leap from the everything to the somethings of the categories to a specific thing. Oh, this is a cypress tree. But it's really important to pay attention to the fact or the principle that we start at everything and then we collapse that down to a category. Now, everything is full of mystery, right? It's very hard to know something about everything. Right? What shall we say about everything? It's too broad. And everything, or the universe, or all that is and has been and will be, that is a very special category that I call the supercontainer. It's one of the deepest root elements of representational thought. So, for example, if we associate a quality with everything, so if we say, for example, the universe is a being, or is more than a being, then every sub-category inherits that quality, right? And if we say the universe is not a being, and is just material, then everything, again, inherits that quality. Whatever qualities we associate or don't associate with the supercontainer are inherited by all subcontainers. And we have traditions of knowledge, which the child's intelligence is capable of unifying. In fact, at first it won't understand why they're distinct at all. And this would be quite an experience for an adult, to have even a moment in which the different ways of knowing were unified in an experience of aware intelligence that is unlike anything we will ordinarily encounter in life, but we may encounter something resembling it in either moments of crisis, ecstasy, birth, and death. In these experiences, the veneer of representational thought is often ripped away. And once it's torn that way, the nature of the invisibles emerges in us in a visionary efflorescence of often wonderful and terrifying import. Terrifying primarily because we are unfamiliar with it. Wonderful because it contains dimensions of feeling and experience and relation that we are ordinarily deprived of by our representational habits. So, knowing what something is a weird gambit. If why we want to know is simply so that we can then sort of ignore the thing we've named and move on to the next thing, then we're in real trouble. Because our capacities for understanding will be catastrophically limited. And it's the same kind of game that you see in other forms in our modern society, where the anatomy of what might be deep relationships is often exchanged for the skeletal remains of tokens, commodities, transactions. Now, of course, in our mind, when I wonder about the tree, we could call that a transaction, but I wouldn't, probably. There are so many different ways of knowing about a tree. The representational one is the least interesting, but has some pragmatic value in our, in our common activity as modern people in modern societies. The sun is setting in the orange light. There is no word I know for this, but I feel the spirit of the hue in the light. I feel the spirit of the departure of the day. And that's an invisible thing. Ordinary language will not convey it, but poetry might evoke in us deep feelings of memory and relation and meaning without description. There is no meaning of the flavor of food unless we're analyzing it, right? The meaning of intimacies that we have with our own bodies, with the living world, with each other, when we're lucky, with nature. These meanings are invisibles. They're interior movements and transformations and effulgences and disappearances. So generally, the models of identity that we're imprinted with are broken. It would be like if I wanted to show you what a human is, but I only showed you the pinky, right? And nothing else. From just seeing a pinky, you wouldn't imagine a hand or a wrist or an arm or a torso or eyes or ears or minds, or right? And this is how it is with us in language. Language is a thin veneer. It's a kind of game we play around identity. And to know what a tree is, we're going to need something vastly deeper than anything that science or philosophy or religion or even poetry can bring us. So we need to be able to, without getting rid of our representational intelligence, we need to be able to set it aside so that it's not shunting away all of the energies of our interiority into very superficial structures and forms, purposes, agendas, what we might call traditions, except they're peculiarly not like the kinds of traditions in which we might place trust. Language is like a phony foot, and we think we're walking toward knowledge when we're using language, and it's not that we can't, but rather that if we're unaware of the ocean, the fact that we're exploring an island may confuse us and get us off on the wrong, going in the wrong direction. And representational intelligence is like a structured island most of the time. Now, of course, it's possible to play in the terrain of representational intelligence and preserve the aspects and assets that underlie its possibility so that we can have actual experience of them while awake and while we're thinking and dreaming and creating and wondering and speculating. But I'm extremely suspicious of the urge for representational mastery in human traditions and in the modern milieu of consciousness. I'm suspicious because I've seen through that veil long ago, and that vision was absolutely fascinating. And still mysterious to me. It didn't solve all my problems, but it helped me understand how our societies and how individual minds can become so misguided as to attack their own origins or even themselves. And this is a common problem because representational thought is prone to hide, inhibit, replace, and counterfeit the faculties and intelligences from which it emerges as a tiny, tiny subset. And it wants to do away with all of that, and the best way to do that is to kill everything. And you want to hide the killing so that it's not in your face, and humans are really good at this. But something like that, the environmental atrocity that we see all around us, has been happening inside us, in our hearts and minds, throughout the development of our lives. And so there's a similar sort of extinction event going on inside us, right alongside the extinction of the living places and the oceans and the atmosphere and the animals and insects. And that shouldn't be surprising because fundamentally around here the world is one being first, separate beings only if we make that distinction on purpose. And if we make that distinction in order to destroy them, well, we're destroying ourselves. And this is true of individuals as well as groups. So our knowledge of identity, deep knowledge of identity, depends not so much on language and models, though those can be helpful if they don't overcome the essence. It depends on intimacy, and intimacy is purposive in the sense that, though it may be entirely natural for me to cleave to the beauty of this tree and to be moved very deeply by the fact that we exist together right now in matter, in time-space. That may be entirely natural, but there's a purposive aspect that underlies that for me, and it's anamnesis. It's the undoing of forgetting. It's remembrance. It's the longing for the unities and forms of intelligence that my body and mind are children of. I want to recover my original family. And I want to know them and to love them, to please them. I want them to be proud of me in the sense of realizing that I am a good child of the universe, of the sun, of the moon, of the world, of the plants, of the animals. And I am a good friend, and I am a good companion. Now, this is personal to me, and not everyone shares the same intense passion that I have in this way. But many of us do, and in childhood, much more of us do. We come to human birth filled with awe and wonder and potential. But the human world, really unnecessarily, gets in the way of that and tries to replace it with tokens and transactions and so on. And some of this may be due to our peculiar evolutionary history, but also to our bilateral cortex. It seems these cortexes on the surface of our brains have very different ways of being in the world from what we presently understand, however primitive our current understanding may be. And of course, the hemispheres always work together, and it's not like either one is the cause or source of some particular way of being. And yet, there's a proclivity in the left hemisphere, which is associated with the right hand, to want to reduce things that are mysterious or uncontrollable to structures that it can manipulate confidently. And that's part of why our interiority gets lost in language and culture. And you can see if you just look at a city, right? A living place was made into a bunch of boxes and roads for machines. Well, it's not entirely dead, but most of the assets that would be natural for a living place to have disappear. And what's left is a terribly impoverished and strangely specialized subset of those organisms that can survive when the context collapses towards structure. And our own minds and hearts are like this. So that as we get older, it's those aspects that are most resilient in the face of the collapse into structure and tokens and transactions that survive in us. And it can be very difficult for them to survive. And for most of the humans I know, they really struggle with trying to live in the remains of our interiority that we can still have some relation with or discover or renew in the highly layered, structured fictions of our society. But the minds we bring to human birth, as I was saying earlier, are like the geologic strata of many ages of terrestrial existence, right? The existence of the world. And the minds that we arrive with when we're born contain profound stratifications of historical development, all of which we are pretty much unaware of, unless those assets are nurtured, activated, rewarded, unless there's a context that calls them forth, because much of our interiority, over time we learn to inhibit it so that we won't scare the natives, so to speak. We won't scare the other moderns around us. And so that we won't be deprived of social, vocational, or relational opportunities because we stand out as different, because we resisted normalization. Now, of course, today you see some expressions of our humanity that pose themselves as the champions of uniqueness. And in some cases, there may be some justification for that pose, but in many, really what we're seeing is a reaction to the incredibly vicious, superficial veneer that our modern ideas and culture frame to us as humans, as being human. And mostly that's a pretty impoverished, skeletal mess. Again, in our common experience. Now, in our life paths, we will each pursue goals and purposes, some of which may involve the resuscitation of our interiority. When we are creative, if we are artistic in any way, if we dance or sing or make music or draw or write or play or improvise. But there's a profound background to the seeking, the aspect of ourselves that seeks, and particularly the aspect that seeks a life path that we want, that we feel to be fulfilling and authentic. And this aspect is like a fairy story or a magic story in the sense that questing is involved. And usually questing involves questions and the desire for deep, intimate understanding of identity and role and meaning and relation. And this questing is something familiar even to small children, because one of their earliest quests involves acquiring the positive attention of adults, particularly usually their parents or alloparents, including grandparents and such. And so the child learns, somewhat by trial and error, somewhat by their own interior nature, to engage in play, exploration, and demonstration of skillfulness or knowledge or intelligence that is rewarded by the adults around them. And then eventually, similarly, they'll begin to do this with other children. Now, of course, the very earliest phases of our infancy are, how shall I put it? They are not form-ish. They are unformed. So everything's all together in a kind of flowing, mysterious, sometimes playful, sometimes frightening miasma. And then, over time, the aspects of our intelligence associated with dreaming, play, questing, they become transformed by our introduction to representational consciousness, and many of them will become inhibited. Again, uniquely for each of us. They are recoverable, however, and we have the profound capacity to quest, and not merely alone in our interiority. Of course, we're never entirely alone in our interiority. It just appears that way and often feels that way. But also with others of like mind. And in a sense, you can see that our modern societies and all of their bizarre activities and veneers and institutions, these are the results of quests. People had purposes long ago, and they established standards, metrics, measurements, commodities, transactional protocols, right? And we're living in the stratified result, right? There's layers and layers of that. And it's not very friendly to our humanity, to put it mildly. It's not friendly to living beings. Our supercultures are incredibly toxic and murderous, rapacious, endlessly hungry, destructive, and yet they give the appearance and portray, each of them in their own way, every subculture, every society, every nation, they portray themselves as heroes on a quest. Isn't that interesting? Wonder why they might do that. Could it be that they're attempting to counterfeit the interior urgency and beauty and promise that we bring to our human birth, that results at first in the quest to acquire language and the positive attention of others, particularly adults, sometimes teachers, sometimes members, sometimes romantic companions. All of these things, you can see how they partake of questing, right? And there's very simple examples that are immediate, not long-term, right? We decide what we will purchase when we go to the grocery store, and then we go to the grocery store and we buy things. We adjust, according to what's present and what's missing. And that's a little mini quest. But the kind of questing I speak about is questing for understanding, for deep vision, for deep intimacy, for wonder. The quest to become beloved of all that is. The quest to be truly good. The quest to fulfill some of the promise of our human incarnation. And that's a quest we're always on, whether we're conscious of it or not. And we feel inside, there's a sense that feels when that quest is being inhibited, prohibited, counterfeited. We can sense all these things, even though we may not be overtly conscious of them. And those things are painful. I spoke earlier of the root elements of knowledge. These I call holophores. The universe, the sun, the moon, animals, plants, trees, food, dreaming, family, mother, light, time, hands, eyes. These are fundamental roots that we rarely think of when we use ordinary language. But they are all involved, for if we did not know the meaning of the world, if we did not have at least a placeholder there, we couldn't then transit from that category to one of the subcategories like plants or animals or humans. And over time, these roots have been catastrophically flattened. They've lost dimensionality. And with that loss, they lost our capacity to relate deeply with them was severely inhibited. Minor corrections to these roots result in cascades of corrections in the subcategories. And this is one of the reasons why relativity was such a profound discovery for physics, because it radically altered a holophore. What is time? What is space? Right? By saying these two cannot be separated. They are always together. And that changed the meaning of everything. But because we have the separate knowledge path of science and within that physics, the implications for identity of relativity were never integrated into our modern ideas. And it's really shocking what would happen to our ideas about identity if the key findings of relativity were integrated into our representational schemas. And part of what we are questing for, if we want understanding, is the repair of the problems in our representational cognition and thought that are the result of historical waves of impoverishment over time. And when I say these roots matter, just imagine one of them going away. Right? Imagine the sun goes away. What do you got? No more life, no more minds, no more language, no more science, no more religion, no more philosophy, no more math, no more anything. Because all of the ideas that we have are local to humans, at least in their representational form. So if humans disappear, all those ideas disappear with us. And whatever the sun might be, the ideas that the humans have about the sun are unique to humans. Or rather, and the experience that we have of the sun is unique to organisms, not just humans. But our human experience is a subclass of organismal experience. And in some ways a metaclass, too. It's sort of both, sub and meta. Knowledge. Such a strange word. No ledge. Right? What's that the ledge of? That might be a childlike question, but it's not without meaning. What ledge do we want to know? Now, of course, this word ledge probably relates to ledger as much as it, like to recording, as much as it relates to edges. But edges are really important too in this strange word. So one of the things that fascinated me when I began speaking is just the difference between representational knowledge, language, concepts, and ideas, and intimacy, which is the form of knowledge I trust more deeply and must be the origin of those forms that appear to overcome it, right? To replace intimacy with methods, tokens, protocols, language, ideas. And so what I want to suggest is that throughout my life, I've had a romance with knowledge. And at first, it was primarily with no, that's not really true. It began in intimacy. And I quickly recognized as a child that the adults, whatever kind of language and knowledge games they were playing, something was badly wrong with them. Something was broken. Something really important at the core of our cognition. And this sliver in my awareness kept bothering me like a paper cut or a sliver in my fingertip throughout my entire life. And eventually, by speaking in analogy, it formed like a little pustule, right? And then eventually that broke. And when that broke, that was the moment I began to have the experience of seeing through representational intelligence towards its origins. And then I began to recognize its dangers and also unique opportunities that are otherwise invisible from our ordinary perspective of concern. So I guess I brought to my birth certain kinds of quests, and I suspect that this is natural to most human beings. They may get lost or distorted during our lifespan as we grow older and are more and more deeply exposed to the pressures and confusions of modern technological cultures, again, which I say are not really cultures. They're much like the structured things that replace intimacy, right? They're the skeletal remains of what might have been relationships, but aren't. And in case you wonder about this whole questing thing and the interior need for vision, for visionary experience that's authentic and trustworthy, you can just notice that millions of people around the world will go to unimaginable lengths to simply sit in front of a screen and have visions presented to them. And not all of that is bad, but a lot of it is deeply confused. And that's a symptom of something being missing, right? Something having been inhibited, prohibited, lost, transformed, buried, replaced, so that we're starving for visionary experience, and people will spend huge chunks of their lives staring into screens to watch things that never happened, right? And to watch people pretending, engaged in wild make-believe and illusion. You know, I watch a TV show, the man turns a lever. The lever has nothing to do with anything. It's my mind that connects the lever to what it's supposed to control. That lever is just a prop. So we spend vast quantities of our time, many of us anyway, watching things on screens. And, you know, many people don't. There are certainly people that just don't like that at all and have long ago, most of them, you know, participated at some point in their lives. But I don't like it. I don't like watching things on screens. I want life. I want roles that matter. I want companions. I want meaningful engagement of my skills, gifts, abilities, and vulnerabilities, weaknesses. I want to explore being human, and I don't want to do it. I don't want that exploration mediated by machines. I don't want it counterfeited by films and television shows and radio programs and so on. Now again, the broadcast media is a vast topology, and there are islands in that topology that are profoundly beautiful and that can actually help us in our quest to reawaken our faculties, intelligences, and curiosity. But most of the field is filled with counterfeits, addictions, pretense, representation. And we must be really, really hungry for something to spend so much time relating with machines. What are we starving for? This is the question we must pursue together. And we must become the answers to this question, not merely derive the theory or the language or the description. I feel the urgent necessity of pursuing anamnesis together. And when I make these recordings, however humble they may be, and I consider them mostly to be very, very humble, I feel humble in making them. This is part of my quest to pursue anamnesis together, to pursue the recovery of our intelligences, our faculties, our anciently evolved relationships with the sky, with origin itself, with time-space, with the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, the living places, all of the animals of the land, of the water, of the air, the insects, the plants, the trees, the microorganisms. For here on earth, we have a paradise, unimaginable if we were to be traveling through the incredibly vacuous expanse of what we understand to be space. Now, of course, our understandings of space are also confused, but we can easily see that the space outside Earth's atmosphere is very unfriendly to organisms as we understand them. That doesn't mean there aren't other kinds that could dwell entirely in space and would find our terrestrial environment deadly. There may well be such forms of life. And if someone asked me to speculate, I'd say it was likely. But there are other classes. The category trees we are given in English are broken. They're missing whole branches of the tree. There are things, there are, how shall I put this? There's a class beyond a being. And one of the classes beyond a being is a superorganism, right? Like the earth, or a beehive, or a pod of dolphins, or a team of humans passionately engaged together in a quest. But there are whole categories missing from our linguistic tree, and it's a fascinating pursuit to attempt their recovery or understanding. There is a class that is more than a being. And if you think about the sun, it must be more than a being. It generates beings as a side effect of its activity in time-space. Now, of course, time-space is involved. There's a relationship there, maybe even a love affair. But something that generates beings must be more than a being, right? Especially if it generates profuse forms of being, the way that the combination of the sun and the planets and the moon and the sky and the earth do. And of course, light and water, which we think of as things, but suppose they're not things. Suppose we got the class wrong for light. What if it's not a thing? What if it's neither a thing nor a being, but it's something mysterious that we have no category for as yet? And what if water is similar? These kinds of questions compel me to continue to try to understand the nature of our experience as beings and the nature of our world and the universe. Earlier I mentioned the supercontainer. What's the universe? And I just want to briefly discuss the possibility that the humans are, not the possibility, I want to discuss a behavior, an intellectual behavior, a cognitive behavior related to the supercontainer. So religions comprise assaults on the supercontainer. And what I mean by that is they want to tell you exactly what the universe is for, and is doing. And if that attack succeeds, all the categories beneath the supercontainer shrivel up. They shrivel into distorted likenesses of whatever limitations we put on the supercontainer. And similarly, if we return mystery and wonder and the unknown, which is truly most of what's going on. In human minds, 99% of what's going on, at least, probably much more than that, is unknown. We have the tiniest little purchase on meaning and identity, cognitively, intellectually, verbally, and yet we're prone to pretend not only that knowledge is complete, but that it's explicitly true, which is impossible. And any move like that will wreck the foundations of a mind. We cannot become intelligent in a situation like that. We will be trapped by the catastrophic poverty of the structured fictions we use to see into identity and meaning. And for most of us, this is the result of our languaging. It gives us some skills and abilities in domains that would otherwise be inaccessible, but the price is far too high. We lose our interiority. We lose the other intelligences and faculties that are natural to our form as an organism and to our spirit and our essence as beings. So you can see all kinds of attacks on the supercontainer and you don't have to go to the universe to make one. You can go to people. What are people? Oh, well, people are just dumb. People are just mean. People are just greedy, right? These are attacks on the supercontainer. They're trying to change one of the root holophores, and if that meaning becomes impoverished, all other related classes and categories inherit that impoverishment. Similarly, if that meaning moves just slightly toward a more inclusive truth, the same result happens in all of the subcategories. The roots of human cognition are badly damaged by tokenization, which has occurred over the past couple thousand years primarily, it seems. Certainly since humans began making settlements. This was a major developmental milestone that set us on a very specific course of probable and actual futures. Cognitively, socially, environmentally, intellectually, spiritually, essentially. And this discovery that our knowledge systems have roots, and that when they're distorted, our minds are damaged, and when they're repaired, our minds flourish. This is a profound and amazing thing to realize. Someone who realizes this will have access to forms of vision and knowledge that others will never come near, except again, perhaps in moments of crisis, transformation, birth, and death. Rescue also, right? There's a great intensity that's beautiful when a being risks themselves to aid another being. This is something that always felt natural to me. And profoundly rewarding. I won't tell personal stories about it at the moment. Some of them are a little silly. But I will tell one. I remember once, I often try to rescue bees that have been downed because it's cold or by pollution. And in the city, that's a pretty common thing. And one day I saw a very large bumblebee, and I had never handled one. When I rescue the bees, I just handle them. I put them in my hand, and I let the warmth of my hand help them to recover their energy, because that warmth allows their body fluids to flow more freely, allows them to breathe and energize their bodies and prepare for flight. And often, almost always, they'll return to the sky after I handle them for a little while. And it's dangerous, They have to understand that I'm not a threat. And if they sting me, they will die, and I will be hurt. But I've never been stung while doing this. But this time it was a bumblebee, and it was a really big one, probably a queen. Or really a matriarch. And I warmed her for a while, and she flew from my hand into the center of the street outside my home. And it was rush hour. And in order to try to continue to help her, I had to essentially kneel down on a busily trafficked street and attempt to coax the bee back to my palm. And I knew that it was not probably terribly likely that I would be killed, but it was certainly possible that I could be killed. And people watching me would have no idea what I was doing. In other words, I would look like I'm being abnormal. Someday I'll make a video about the problems of humans simulating the surveillance and perspectives of others in order to try not to offend someone or something or break some rule or look like they're not normal, so on and so forth. This is a huge topic because in our minds, many of us are constantly simulating surveillance, and that's not too surprising because we learn to form minds under the surveillance of our parents and peers. So it's not surprising that awareness of being surveilled is crucially important and provocatively formative of both our thinking, one moment, and our speaking. I know people who are so compelled by the circle of interior critics they've adopted in their minds that they can barely put a sentence together because they don't trust the language. And it's good that they don't trust the language. The problem is the profusion of critical mindsets that are essentially attacking them while they're only merely trying to say something. Right? And this has become vastly more common today than I think it's ever been. Topic for another talk, however. Although, I want to say something further about this. It's only been about 20 or 30 years since we could all be closely surveilled much of the time, and our thoughts and movements and actions could be either recorded or inferred by our activity with machines. That is a toxic nightmare for human minds. That is a mausoleum where our interiority shrivels up and dies. We cannot survive the necessity of simulating the constant surveillance, not merely of people, but of institutions, corporations, governments. This is the kind of inhibition whose injustice is monumental. And I believe that we must find a way to give answer to this and to invert that paradigm so that we have the capacity for positive mutual observation, but we are protected and have privacy in our lives and thoughts and interests and quests. Privacy is one of the most important assets that can protect our interiority from the ever-hungry and ever more deadly and inhibiting aspects of our modern situation. I was talking about attacks on the supercontainer. It's very difficult to not generalize. In fact, if I look back over this talk, I'll find that I was generalizing all over the place. But there are certain modes of generalization that are particularly problematic for knowledge and intelligence. And these are the forms I'm concerned about. It's weird. One can attack the supercontainer from the direction of religion and say, everything is just this God game. And one can also attack it from the perspective of science and say, there are no non-physical beings. There's no evidence of non-physical beings. The universe is just material, and the fact that there's organisms is an accident of that material. It seems wildly impossible to me. But I can understand the motives that produce that lens, right? The motives of acquiring what we might call justified true belief, or what we sometimes refer to as objective knowledge. Peculiar idea, there are no objective perceivers, there never were. And the fact that two perceivers agree doesn't render their perceptions objective. However, we can use the language in a limited way and understand what is meant by it without agreeing to its overarching authority. And in my entire talk, you can see in the background this topic of authorization. What do we authorize in our thinking? What do we authorize in our cultures? What do we authorize in our interiority, in our dreaming? What do we pay attention to as truly trustworthy and authentic? And you can see all around us the rather surprising crisis that we moderns face, particularly as individuals, but also as cohorts and communities and nations. Presuming, of course, the communities actually still exist. Of course, some do, right? When I use this word community, this is the problem with generalizations. I'm referring to, a billion different things with one word. And it's easy to become lazy and think, because I know the word community, I know what I'm referring to. I don't. Again, now I've finally circled back. More than 99% of whatever's going on is completely unknown. 70% of it might be unknowable. And much more of it is unknowable in terms of representational consciousness, right? And the forms of knowledge that we associate with representational consciousness are profoundly limited. They're a very thin veneer and a very specialized aspect of knowledge. If we were to take just our representational knowledge, we know way, way less than 1/1,000,000% of what's going on. And in fact, our representational knowledge is meaningless without our interiority to interpret and respond, to formulate, to object, to reformulate, and to continue that process. Right? I was talking with someone the other day about some statistics, and they said, well, where are the statistics for this? There's no statistics for this. We've got all these statistics for this. And I talked about how statistics very rarely capture much of the phenomenon they're associated with, and the phenomenon continues to transform and diversify vastly faster than any kind of testing or measurement can catch up with. But I said to my conversation partner, well, there's essentially two reasons. This isn't true, but this was my clumsy movement, my clumsy move at the moment. I said there's essentially two reasons to seek knowledge, to look at statistics, to look at research. The first is to confirm your opinion or what you already believe. You look for evidence that supports your biases, your beliefs, your opinions. not particularly intelligent, tends to lead to a particular kind of ignorance. And the other is to learn, right? To transform what one thinks or believes. And after mentioning that, I produced the statistic that my companion said had not been provided. And I said, like, here's the statistic that you said we couldn't find, that no one's talking about. It's right here. CDC statistic, not unsurprisingly. And thankfully, my companion, and we are well known to each other, to put it mildly, was responsive, right? And realized, maybe learning is more important than validating my pet grudge. But these are the kinds of choices that we face as representational humans immersed in a kind of psychological warfare through our relationship with news and media and so on and so forth. And it's tragic. But if we would just allow the unknown, the mystery of being, back into our consideration, right? And stop forming models that pretend that they're complete or true. If we could suspend some degree of our trust in the representational paradigms that we've learned to emulate, then our chances to grow, our opportunities for anamnesis would immediately flourish. And that would be a beautiful thing, something I always hope for, something I'm always pursuing with love and passion and wonder. The moon is just past the first quarter. It's beautiful. I can see the stars, Orion, the Dipper. It's nighttime. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that our journey together has been nourishing and has brought some inspiration and insight into your inner world. I look forward to walking and learning together again soon. Bye-bye for now.